Lacan hits the ground running in Seminar 19, and right back to Aristotle, of all people. Why? Because he wants to show that the formulas of sexuation that he began to develop in his previous seminar, Seminar 18, on a discourse that might not be a semblance, that these formulas are founded on a certain mathematical logic, as he calls it, extending from antiquity, in which letters and numbers, when italicized, overlined, not underlined, but overlined, flipped backwards, turned upside down, you get the idea, washed up in all sorts of contorted shapes. These letters and numbers, when they wash up, can be used to account for the impossible, which is to say, the real. This is what's up with Lacan's Mathemes, as he now starts to call them. And one real impossibility in particular, the sexual relation. On this point, our boy is adamant, but also elusive, I find, at the start of Seminar 19. He says, even though there is no such thing as sexual relation, it nevertheless regulates everything that is involved in our experience to such an extent that this non-existence of the sexual rapport constitutes the basic question of human togetherness. Not just sexed social life. The claim is starker than that. It's a basic question of human togetherness. Which is why I'm starting our series on Seminar 19 here, on the question of a sexual relation which is no such thing. A question which is also, apparently, a difficult one for Lacanians to answer. Notice how Lacan broaches this topic at the bottom of page 4 in the standard English translation of Seminar 19. This fact of saying, which I'm taking up from last year's seminar, is expressed, as is any fact of saying, in a complete proposition. There is no such thing as sexual relation. What this year's title proposes is that there's no ambiguity about this. Move outside it, and what you will say will only be worse. Here he's toying with the title of Seminar 19, which is or worse, and he's referring back to Seminar 18 and arriving at this proposition, there is no such thing as sexual relation. Notice where he goes from here. There is no such thing as sexual relation. This proposition is proposed, and therefore as a truth. I've already said, however, the truth can only come mid-say. So what I'm saying is that all in all, what the other half says is worse. How much simpler things would be if there were no worse. At this point, there is no such thing as a sexual relation. It's still just a proposition. That's one of the important parts to take away from this opening passage at the start of Seminar 19. It's still just a proposition. But it's not just any proposition, as Lacan clarifies. It's a truth proposition, by which I mean it's a proposition that has a certain truth value. This also is something that he establishes in Seminar 18 and in our previous series that we worked pretty hard with, to establish a truth valuational logic, by which any given proposition or statement can be tested to the extent that it approximates or speaks a truth, whether or not it's true. So the question here is the proposition, there's no such thing as a sexual relation, high or low in its truth value? If it's high, if it has a high truth value, like the proposition 2 + 2 = 4 in standard vanilla mathematics, we know that that has a very high truth value. If this proposition about there being no such thing as a sexual relation has a high truth value, it will cleave close to the truth of psychoanalysis. If, however, it has a low truth value, like the proposition in vanilla math of 2 + 2 = 5, then this proposition about there being no such thing as a sexual relation will not cleave close to the truth of psychoanalysis. So that's what he's up to here in part, by connecting propositional logic to truth value. Now, we don't need to go too far into this. In many ways, we've crossed that bridge before. What I want to ask is the nature of the truth of psychoanalysis. What is this truth that the proposition there's no such thing as a sexual relation approximates? The truth of psychoanalysis, as you've heard me say in previous series, and as I'll never tire of saying, at least at this point, is weakness. The truth of psychoanalysis is incapacity. The truth of psychoanalysis is impotentiality. Remember, what Lacan is also up to here at the start of Seminar 19 is a return to Aristotle's theory of modal logic, necessary, contingent, actual, possible, and with them impossible, the potential and the impotential. Here, though, that detumescence, that impotence also rings true for Lacan's thought. The truth of psychoanalysis, weakness, incapacity, impotentiality, all of which is summed up in a single word, castration. The truth of analytic theory and technique is castration. And this is precisely what any true proposition in and about analytic experience says. There's more to this than can be said. I'm powerless to go further, to know more, to say the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God. You see, that's why we need God's help, because the whole truth can't be said. That's the dilemma of the truth. For Lacan, it always splits into the part of truth that can be said and the part of truth that cannot be said. And the part of truth that can be said, you've heard me say, always says the same thing. There's this other part to me, this other part that can't be said. I can't say much more about it except that it's out there. That's what a true statement always says. Whether as symptom or as matheme, it says there is more to this than I can say. I am powerless, incapable, and impotent to go further in its direction. So let me be clear. Statements of truth for Lacan are always at root statements of limitation, constraint, incapacity, powerlessness, which is a theme that comes up at the start of 19 and also was a theme that figured prominently in his simultaneous across-town lecture on the psychoanalyst knowledge, which we did a little mini-series on. You can check it out. These are all statements of truth that are fundamentally statements of castration. The part of truth, any truth, that can be said, always says just that, in other words. There's another side to all of this that can't be said. I really want to emphasize this because it shows that a true statement for Lacan is one that is always on the edge of some kind of a hole, an edge in knowledge where truth opens up. And to speak at that edge is to engage in statements of impotentiality. I'm at this edge, I can't go any further with this. There's something out there that is nothing. Beyond this point, I can't reach it. This is why Lacan also quips in these years about truth being in love with itself. And I don't mean love in the profound Lacanian sense. I mean love in the narrow, naive sense. Truth is in love with itself, says Lacan, because it can't stop talking about itself. Truth never shuts up about itself. Do you see how I'm getting at that? What Lacan means is that true statements always say there's more to be said. They always say, I am a partial statement of truth. There's this other side that I really can't speak about. And in this sense, truth is always talking about itself, about its other half. And you don't need examples really to make sense of this beyond a simple love letter, a simple postcard, any profession of love. And here I am at the end of January 2024 recording this with Valentine's Day right around the corner. And here's what those love letters say. Here's what those cards say. Words fail as I try and describe my love for you. And so we resort to metaphor, and so we resort to poetry. But what we're always saying again and again is, my love far exceeds anything that I could write in this paltry letter. That's a statement of truth in the field of love. And what it says is, there is way more to my love for you than what I could possibly pronounce in a letter of this sort, in a card, in a postcard. I wish I could tell you how much. Words fail. I can't quite find the words for this. There is no stronger testament to one's love of another in the more profound sense than this statement of incapacity, this statement of weakness. I am powerless to go further in pronouncing my love for you. You see? This, for Lacan, is a true statement because it speaks castration. So how does all of this then relate to the sexual relation, which is no such thing? Well, the sexual relation doesn't exist, and it cannot be spoken or written into existence. But here's the thing. This statement, namely the statement, the sexual relation doesn't exist, and it cannot be written into existence or spoken into existence, this statement about its impossibility does exist. It can be said, it can be written, and thus forced into existence. The sexual relation doesn't exist, it's impossible. But the statement, the sexual relation doesn't exist, it's impossible, does exist. We can work with the statement, even if we do not have a referent for it. Which is why, I believe, there's no such thing as a sexual relation constitutes a true statement, a proposition that Lacan here categorizes as a truth, because it's ultimately a statement of the impossible. And when I say the impossible, I mean the real. Let's be categorical right out of the gates. We're not fucking around. Statements of truth are statements of impossibility, and the latter are always pronouncements of the real. Where do we see them, these pronouncements? Where do we see pronouncements of the real in what Lacan really wants to be known as the Lacanian field? He says as much. He's explicit. We commented on it in our previous series. Where do we see these pronouncements of the impossible, of the real, in the Lacanian field? A field that, as you well know, is defined as much by theory as it is by technique, by concept as much as by this thing called the psychoanalytic act. Again, let's be pointed. It's in symptomatic expressions and mathematical formulations built atop these symptomatic expressions, built out of these symptomatic expressions. It's in the symptom and in the matheme that the real becomes legible. And I dare say, maybe even just a bit intelligible. Which is why the discourse of the analyst became the centerpiece of Lacan's teaching after Seminar 17. Now that may seem like a big jump. It's not. This is still with him here. It becomes the centerpiece of Seminar 17, albeit on the flip side, right? Because the other side of psychoanalysis is the discourse of the master. But as Lacan tells us at the start of Seminar 18, These discourses exist on a Mobius strip. So the other side of the discourse of the master is the discourse of the analyst. And that's what becomes the centerpiece of Lacan's thought after Seminar 17, right up to this point at the start of Seminar 19. So that includes Seminar 17, throughout Seminar 18, and into this other Seminar 19 that we recently did a mini-series on called The Psychoanalyst Knowledge. The discourse of the analyst figures prominently there, and precisely in connection with what Lacan is up to with truth, the real, and discourses thereof. Let's get after it. The discourse of the analyst is a matheme, and in fact, it's in conversation with the group at St. Anne around the discourse of the analyst that Lacan coins or brings forward this Greek notion of matheme, that which is teachable. This is basically a breakthrough in how he thinks he teaches. What does Lacan teach? He says he teaches mathemes. Hence, his back turned to the audience, writing on the board. And the dilemma you hear him talking about. When my back is turned to you and I'm writing on the board, you complain that you can't hear me. But when I speak to you directly, we're not doing the work of teaching. Why? Because the matheme is written. It needs to be written on the board. It's all across the night sky. Lacan just brings it to the blackboard occasionally. The point here is that the discourse of the analyst is a matheme. And it's a matheme that accounts for symptomatic expressions. So pronouncements of the real find expression at the level of the symptom and the matheme. And the discourse of the analyst is really terrific because it itself is a matheme that allows us to account for symptoms. So you can see how it becomes this nucleus around which we can figure things related to statements of impossibility, pronouncements of the real, and the like, mathematically and symptomologically. The matheme of the discourse of the analyst is a formal, mathematical theory about how clinical experience conditions analysans to utter statements of the impossible, of their own personal impossible, beyond which their discourse fails, beyond which discourse itself fails, at least for the time being, foundering on truths of which the analysand remains ignorant, which is to say, unconscious. This is exactly what you see in the lower part of the discourse of the analyst. Take a look at this thing. It's an S1 and an S2 divided by a delta of impotence. How are we to read this curious form of writing? S2 triangle S1. And what I'll do right now is I will write out the discourse of the analyst so you can see once more the formula that we're talking about here. In the bottom part of the discourse of the analyst, you see an S2 triangle S1. This triangle, this delta of impotence, as Lacan defines it. Let's start with the S2 in the bottom left-hand quadrant of the discourse of the analyst. Now, traditionally, you can understand this S2 as knowledge of the truth of the unconscious that conditions the agency of the analyst as objet, which is why whenever we write Lacan's theories of discourse, you see the bottom left-hand position of truth being the cause or the condition of the upper left-hand position of agency. So, the master shows up as S1, but the cause or the condition for that semblance of masterful agency, I speak and the world works, is barred subjectivity. That's what you see in the lower left-hand quadrant of the discourse of the master. The truth of their agency is that they are castrated. In other words, that they are not masterful and omnipotent, but castrated and impotent, like the rest of us. So in the bottom left of every Lacanian discourse, you see truth. And this truth is a cause or condition for the semblance of agency that appears in the top left. And that's what I'm getting at here. The cause or the condition for the semblance of agency that the analyst presents when they show up as objet A and all of the variants, think back to our lectures on the analyst, is knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. But that's not the only way to understand S2. If we're looking just at the bottom row, S2 bears a relation to the delta of impotence and this S1. In other words, it bears a relation not just to the analyst, but to the analysand. Let me explain. S2 isn't just knowledge of the truth of the unconscious for the analyst. Relative to the analysand, S2 also has a meaning. It's not knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, but ignorance of a certain unconscious truth. For the analyst, S2 means knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. For the analysand, however, it's ignorance of an unconscious truth, a field of knowledge that is unbeknownst to them. That's what S2 means. S2 is the unconscious truth that ultimately causes and conditions the symptomatic expressions of the analysand. And that's what S1 means. If S2 is the unconscious truth of the analysand, a field of knowledge unbeknownst to them, S1 is the symptomatic expression commanded by this unconscious truth. And we represent that commandment by adding another arrow here. The barred subject, here's your analysand, creates, emits, utters, coughs up symptoms. There's that S1. And so you can see the circuit here, S2 with an arrow pointed up to objet A, barred subject with an arrow pointed down to S1. And notice this is not a circuit. There's a rupture or a break in here. There is no arrow from S1 to S2. In all of Lacan's discourses, there's a hole in between the two lower positions. And you've been with us. You've seen Seminar 17. You've seen Seminar 18. You've seen our lectures on the psychoanalyst knowledge. I believe you have a sense of where we're headed with all of this. Always toward that delta of impotence. It's what so many thinkers, according to Lacan, when they deal with his discursive theory, miss. When they try and mechanize and gear up a theory of discourse in Lacan, what they miss is that it's not just these four positions. There's a fifth position, which is a position that is holed out, ruptured, a caesura of sorts between the two lower positions of product and truth, represented here by that triangle. The triangle here represents the inability, the incapacity, the impotentiality of the analysand to account for their S1s and their S2s. Both fields of experience are damn near unintelligible to the analysand. And their relation, their causal relation, if we could be more precise here, because the unconscious truth of which the analysand is unaware is precisely what commands their symptomatic expressions. In other words, the causal relation between S2 and S1 is also completely unfathomable at this point to the analysand. And yet, I think one of the ways to read this triangle is to suggest that coming to terms with the S1, the S2, and their causal relation is precisely what the analysand needs to do. In other words, what needs to happen here is that mountain range, which is one way to read this triangle. There's a mountain range, a mountain between S1 and S2. That motherfucker needs to be climbed, scaled, summited, saddled, and down the other side. It's a great way to understand the delta of impotence. It's a mountain range at the base of which the analysand finds themselves in the field of symptomatic expressions, bewildered, befuddled, and impotent at the base of a mountain that needs to be climbed. Now, we went over all of this in a recent series on Seminar 17, Seminar 18 in the Psychoanalyst Knowledge, to such an extent that I'd wager you're tired of talking about it. Hell yeah, you're definitely even tired of hearing about it from me. If only Lacan were on board. At the start of Seminar 19, he's still got discourse on his mind, the discourse of the analyst in particular, and more specifically still, the impossibility signaled by the analysand's stammering symptomatic speech, the cause of which, again, they know not. Check it out, page 6 of Seminar 19. We read 4 to 5. We are now prepared for page 6. It's the middle paragraph that begins, indeed. You don't have to have the book in front of you because I can just read it here aloud. Indeed, you can see that simply by taking this first faint step, we have thereby slid, without even the time to backtrack, into the midst of something where there is a machine that sweeps us along. It is this machine that I'm dismantling. However, this remark is intended for the use of certain people here. This is not to demonstrate that it is a machine, nor even less, so that a discourse should be taken for a machine, as some have done in seeking to gear into my discourse. So he's calling out folks who would take Lacan's discourse, the discourse of the analyst, but also his broader theory of discourse, this four-footed animal that he develops in Seminar 17, and turn it into some kind of a machine. Isn't this exactly why Seminar 17 is so appealing to so many would-be Lacanians? Because the hope there is that if you study the discourses, you get these little machines that can go out in the world and help you make sense of masters, professors, hysterics, and so on and so on. Lacan is saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. If this is a machine, rest assured, that motherfucker is broke. Look at this. In so doing, what they have demonstrated, in other words, in trying to mechanize and gear up a Lacanian theory of discourse, they have failed in one particular way. What they have demonstrated is how they fail to gear into the very thing that forms a discourse, namely the real that passes through it. The real passes through every Lacanian discourse. Where? Right in between the two lower positions in this delta of impotence that all too often is ignored in post-Lacanian discourse theory. Dismantling the machine is on no account the same thing as what we have just done, namely to proceed without any further ado to the hole in the system, that is, to the site at which the real passes through you, and how it passes because it lays you flat. The real passes through discourse, and it passes through those who speak it, and it lays them flat. Symptoms lay analysands flat, grinding their associations to a halt, because they are sites at which the real that passes through discourse and through them finds expression in what we have defined from radiophony forward as real discourse. It's a discursive form, make no mistake about it, but one that oddly enough repeatedly ruptures discourse itself. The delta of impotence is a rupture at the center of the foundational elements of any given discourse. And what the symptom as S1 does in the discourse of the analyst is it shows an analysand laid flat before this real, at the base of this very real mountain range, this rift, because that's what a mountain range is, right? It's a break between two continents, two plates that grind together and produce this upshot. It's the inverse of the canyon, but it has the very same effect. It's the function of the crack. So let's see if we can put all this together. Knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, S2, conditions the semblance of agency in the analyst, OJI, which in turn begets the analysand, to speak as a divided subject. There's your barred subject in the upper right. And in so doing, to produce symptomatic expressions that always, once more, say the same thing, as the analyst observes the analysand laid flat. Beyond this point, I can speak no further. That's what the symptom says. Here I find my limit. That's what the symptom says. Here I find myself unable, incapacitated, impotent, powerless, in short, castrated. That's what the symptom says. Anyone who would turn Lacan's theory of discourse into a machine would miss this part of his theory. Indeed, of all of Lacan's mathemes, I would even add. Namely, that all discourses, even and especially his, are ruptured discourses, hold discourses, not whole discourses, hold as in hold out, as in bored through, as in split and sundered discourse. And all of Lacan's mathemes, like all of his discourses, are formulations of one thing more than any other, impasse. The matheme is there to lend letters, numbers, and mathematical formulation to the impasse that we see as this little mountain range between truth and product in the discourse of the analyst. This mountain range between truth and product in all of Lacan's discourse. The mathemes are there to formulate in algorithmic fashion these impasses. There's a very real sense, in other words, that Lacan's theory of discourse doesn't have shit to do with truth, agent, other, or product. It has to do with this gap or this hole in their constellation, where you don't see a star, but instead a black hole. I don't think we've gone astray from seminar 19 here. On the contrary, this is precisely what's up with the proposition that there is no such thing as a sexual relation. Check out, for instance, the final sentence of chapter 1 on page 14. It's the chapter we've been working with here. By constituting a question, sexual relation, which is no such thing, in the sense that one cannot write it, determines everything that is developed in terms of a discourse, the nature of which is to be a ruptured discourse. In order to begin asking this question of a sexual relation, which is no such thing, and notice, I'm talking about questions, not answers here, I think we have to stick with Lacan's matheme for the discourse of the analyst for just a second longer, and exactly as he tells us to stick with it in the previous two series on 18 and the psychoanalyst knowledge, this became abundantly clear. In what Lacan describes as the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. This is indeed where he would have us position the discourse of the analyst. It's on this frontier between truth and knowledge. It's a frontier that we know as the littoral zone. We've been over all this before. Refer back to our series on Seminar 18 and the psychoanalyst knowledge. Since we've been over this, but I realize not everybody was with us for those series. Let me be brief, schematic, and summative here. Recall what we've got so far. We've got the discourse of the analyst here, in exactly the way that we've described it. Knowledge of the truth of the unconscious conditions the agency of the analyst, which provokes the barred subjectivity of the analysand to cough up symptomatic expressions. And between these symptoms and the unconscious truth that command them in the analysand, there is this break, this rupture, this mountain range, before which the analysand is laid flat. Now, what matters for us, as we've seen in our previous series, is not just this delta of impotence in between, but these two arrows on the side, these arrows of causality, where S2 causes or conditions the agency of the analyst, and where the barred subject causes or conditions the production of symptoms. And you'll recall that what we did with those arrows was we expanded them in service to this idea that the discourse of the analyst exists in the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. So I'm going to rewrite this thing in a way that I think is pretty useful. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those two side arrows and I'm going to expand them to encompass the other side of the formula. You'll see it, you've seen it before, but I'm going to draw it again because I think it's really important that we work these through. So S2 has an arrow that conditions the agency of the analyst. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw that arrow in the form of a circle that comes all the way around the other side of the formula so that it looks like this. It's the same causality. The trajectory has not changed. The S2 conditions points to objet A in the position of the agent in the discourse of the analyst. What I've done, though, is I've expanded this arrow to become a circle at the center of which is the right-hand side of the formula for the discourse of the analyst. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side with that trajectory from the barred subject to the symptom. The trajectory is going to stay the same, but I'm going to draw a circle coming out to the left, going around the position of the analyst, and coming back and pointing at S1. The trajectories have not changed. We've just expanded these arrows to create, effectively, a couple of Euler circles. They don't have to be accurate. You can see how sloppy mine are. It's good to write them out, though. So you take the discourse of the analyst and the two side arrows, and you expand them into circles that are overlapping, producing three realms. Two on the side and one in the middle, an intersectional zone where they overlap. And you know how we've labeled these zones in the past. On the right-hand side, in the circle constituted by the causal relation between knowledge of the truth of the unconscious and the semblance of agency we see in the analyst, this circle is one of knowledge. This is where we see the symbolic. This is where we see surplus enjoyment. Again, we've been over all this. You can refer back to our previous series. I'm throwing this up by way of review. This right-hand circle is one of knowledge. It's the field of the symbolic. It's the realm of civilization. It's the field of surplus enjoyment. And now you can guess what the left-hand circle is in this Euler diagram that we've generated from the discourse of the analyst. Not knowledge, but truth. Not the symbolic, but the real. And not surplus enjoyment, but the sexual. Sexual jouissance, as we've defined it. Here I hold it up again so that those watching can actually see how we've labeled these things. The right-hand circle is one of knowledge, the left hand is one of truth. And so you can see the discourse of the analyst smack dab in between, on the palpable frontier between truth and knowledge. And what do we call this space? This space in between, this intersectional zone where the discourse of the analyst unfolds. Dun, dun, dun. It's the littoral zone. From Seminar 18, refer back to, I believe these lectures are already public, our work on that littoral zone. It's terrific stuff. It's breakthrough stuff in Lacan's thought. Definitely worth checking out. The intersectional zone between these two spaces, and let me be clear, the space of intersection where we see the delta of impotence, I'll remind you, is called the littoral zone in Lacan's thought. And you know that this in environmental studies is a very particular term. We're talking about beaches here. The beach is what you see between land and sea. And that's what you see in this littoral zone in between. Again, I hold up the diagram so you can see how we're labeling these three arenas. And I would like you to think about this indeed as sea, land, with a beach in between. On the side of truth, we have the sea. On the side of knowledge, we have land. Kind of makes sense if you think about it. Most humans on Earth live just there, on Earth, on land. You can live out to sea. People do it. You can have your house on pylons out in the ocean. You can make a go of that. You could live on a boat. Some people do. Most folks live on land. That's the space of knowledge, society, the symbolic, and the like. And the depths of the sea, let me tell you, if you want to track down some aliens, you don't need to go to outer space. You need to go deep in the sea. The depths of the ocean have not been explored. This is one of the last frontiers on our planet. The depths of the sea are unplumbed. This is why we use the sea to symbolize truth, the real, sexual jouissance, not its fallen surplus sibling. And what we see between the ocean and land is a beachhead, a zone in between, a coastline that is constantly shifting. And it's worth us noting what happens in this coastline, this littoral zone. Lacan, of course, loves it because littoral also suggests litter, debris, for reasons we've discussed at length. What I think makes it most useful, though, is the littoral zone in environmental science is a realm between land and sea that is defined by a high and low water mark. And forgive me, apologies, if you've already seen our series on Seminar 18, where we go through all of this in great detail. So again, I'll try and be brief here. There's a high tide mark and a low tide mark in any littoral zone. You can see it. Just walk the beach by any ocean. At the high tide mark, what we see is truth washing up onto the shores of knowledge. What we see here is the real coming inland. What we see here is the symptomatic expression of the analysand. That's what this arrow tells us. The arrow that produced this circle is what we see is the high tide mark occupied by the analysand. Split subject coughing up S1s, or symptomatic expressions. And again, I'm going fast. Know that you can, though, refer back to our series on 18, where we slow down and spell this out in a recursive fashion. What I want to emphasize again is this bizarre, recursive, weird trajectory that we see. The bard subject begins on land and then courses out to sea and then returns as symptom, as S1. And the way that we can read that is as a progression from symbolic to real and then back to the symbolic. That's what that left-hand circle indicates. The analysand begins in the symbolic, passes into the real, and then stumbles back up out of the sea, as you've seen in so many movies when folks come washing up on the beach as a symptom. Now, that's at high tide. That's what that line to the right indicates. It's a high tide mark occupied by the analysand. Now, what about the other side of this littoral zone, the left-hand side, the side where you see the position of the analyst as objet A, sitting atop the truth of the unconscious of which they are aware? At this low tide mark, in this littoral zone between truth and knowledge, what we see is knowledge stretched furthest out to sea. The same way that at low tide, that's as far as you can go and still be on land without stepping into the ocean. Think about it that way, quite literally, if you will. What we see here is the symbolic at the edge of the real. We see mathematical formulas of the analyst precisely here. At high tide, we see symptom. At low tide, we see matheme. At high tide, we see the symptoms of the analysand. At low tide, we see mathematical formulations produced by radical psychoanalytic theorists. Again, there's a curious trajectory here. The analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious begins at the limits of knowledge itself, at this low tide mark, at the furthest point you can go and still be on land. And then it zooms back inland, deep into the symbolic, and then swirls back out to this edge of the whole in knowledge. Here, the trajectory is not from the symbolic to the real and back to the symbolic. This arrow of causality, of conditionality, that forms the right-hand circle in the Euler diagram that we've been messing with, building on and summarizing work we've done up to this point. It shows instead from the real to the symbolic and back to the real again. Now I'm fast, I'm loose with this stuff at this point because we're driving at a very particular angle. The question we want to ask, though, by way of review, schematic and otherwise, is how on earth, or at sea, if you prefer, are we to integrate these two trajectories, that of the analysand that produces symptoms and that of the analyst that results in mathemes? How are we to integrate these two trajectories? In other words, how are we to make good on the very promise that you see in Lacan's Discourse of the Analyst? The Discourse of the Analyst promises and provides an opportunity to link analyst and analysand, matheme and symptom in the same mathematical formulation. Lacan's asking us to stitch these two trajectories together. At the risk of doing this too fast and too furiously, I will refer back to the final lecture in our recent mini-series on the psychoanalyst knowledge and say that you have 4 stops, if you will, that allows for the integration of these trajectories. The first point, and I'll put a dot right here in the field of knowledge, in the field of the symbolic, is social. This is society. Society, through all of its prohibitions, constraints, and castrative alienating logics, produces the unconscious. This is our second stop. And at the risk of making things look wildly confusing, I've introduced dots in a different color into this diagram in hopes that it will clarify this. The first dot is one of society, of the symbolic, of knowledge, of surplus enjoyment, and the like. The second is that of the unconscious, out in the field of truth, out in the real, and so forth. But what you've heard me say is that the unconscious truth of which the analysand is unaware is precisely what commands their symptomatic expressions. It's my unconscious that dictates my symptomatic speech. So from the unconscious, we see a return arrow, no longer at sea, but back up on land in the form of the symptom. And that symptom is going to be occurring at the high tide mark, or thereabouts. Sometimes they go a little further inland, sometimes they don't quite go all the way. Tides change. Some are higher than others. A king tide is going to wash way further inland than a regular high tide. So I introduce a few extra dots here. From society to the creation of the unconscious, and from the unconscious to the commandment of symptomatic expressions at high tide. Fast and loose, remember, we're driving at something here. And then all of these particles, debris, trash, litter of the human mind that comes washing up in the form of a symptom as a broken signifier, the stutter, the stammer, the hesitation, the grunt, the groan, the moan, the inhalation. These are all the backwards, turned around, upside down, partially eroded letters and numbers that are precisely the ones Lacan, at low tide, gathers up in order to form mathemes. And so I'm going to introduce a fourth arrow here. Society conditions the unconscious. The unconscious conditions the symptom, and the symptomatic speech of the analysand is precisely what Lacan is gathering up in bits and pieces to develop mathemes. So if you want this four-part trajectory in a very clear and coherent fashion, it's like this. Society in the field of the symbolic, with all of its constraints, prohibitions, and castrative alienating logics, produces the unconscious as a field where repressed signifiers, broken down and otherwise, go. This is out to sea in the field of the real, in the field of truth. Here, the unconscious truth. And this unconscious truth that each of us has, presuming that we're all, more or less on a neurotic spectrum, which is a big presumption, of course. These unconscious truths in the neurotic produce symptomatic expressions, partial utterances, not where the signifier that resides in the unconscious coughs up, but some of its letters, some debris from that process coughs up. And you'll recall the image we had of this, right? Is of litter that starts on land, rolls out into a river, washes out to sea, gets battered around, and then washes back up at high tide as the broken shoe without laces, the deer whose hooves have been spray painted. You see what I'm saying? Recall these images. So you have society that produces the unconscious that commands the symptom, and fourth and finally, you have the analyst there, present, listening, gathering up symptomatic expressions and arranging them in all of their upside down and backwards littered state, their literal state, into formulas known as mathemes. Society begets the unconscious begets the symptom, and the symptom begets the matheme. Boom, that is it. That is what Lacan is up to here. You don't believe me, do you? You think I'm making this shit up? I feel like I have to tell you every single time, I am not making this shit up. It's straight out of the book. Page 7. Let's see, we did page 4 to 5. We did page 6. We are now ready for page 7. This is a great little passage on page 7 where he talks about the right theory. The right theory is the one that clears the very path along which the unconscious had been reduced to insisting. So here what he's up to here? The unconscious insists in a way that produces symptoms. And the right theory, read matheme, the right mathematical formulation, is one that continues and works with that path, with that trajectory established by the unconscious, which had been reduced to insisting. There would be no further need to insist had the path actually been cleared, though this doesn't mean that everything would be resolved, quite the contrary, since it would offer this facility. The right theory ought to be light to the point that it seems not to touch it. It ought to possess the naturalness that until now has only been possessed by errors. Once again, not all of them, of course. So the right theory is one that continues the path of the unconscious. Society produces the unconscious paves this way into land again in the form of the symptom, and the mathematical theorizations that Lacan is after here at this point in his thought continue that work. That's what he's saying here. The right theory, the right mathematical logic that he wants at this point is one that would continue the pathway of the unconscious, but in a light fashion. The error in question here, the errors begotten by the unconscious, those are symptoms. These are the S1s. The symptom is the error in speech that the unconscious coughs up. But notice Lacan's clarification here. Not every error, misspeak, hesitation, inhalation, that occurs in analytic experience is a symptom. Not every slip of the tongue is a symptomatic expression. The test of whether a slip of the tongue, an error here, is indeed a symptomatic expression is the degree to which it approximates an unconscious truth. Do you hear what I'm saying here? I'm telling you that symptoms, like propositions, have a truth valuational logic. The test of whether any given parapraxis is indeed a symptomatic expression is the extent to which it contains or crystallizes a truth, an unconscious truth. And we can test that. You test symptoms for their truth value. If it has a high truth value, the symptom will cleave close to the unconscious truth that produced it. If it has a low truth value, it could just be a meaningless slip of the tongue. Now, I hesitate to say that meaningless slip of the tongue, but literally that is precisely what they are. Meaning for Lacan is opacity. Meaning for Lacan at this point in his thought is a trap. Anytime you think you've got an answer to the question, rest assured you've made a wrong path. Anytime meaning lends itself to an experience, rest assured you're missing the truth. Meaning is not the field of truth. The field of truth is the field of stumbling, is the field of stammering, is the field of error, is the field of mathematical formulas that use letters in ways that are unpronounceable. In other words, that can only be written. You know what? We've done enough with chapter 1. We read the front, we read the back. Let's dip into chapter 2 here. I got 2 more passages I want to share with you, and then we're out. This one on page 16 is a longer one, but it gets us close to the idea that what happens in the symptom and what happens in the matheme is not what happens in the field of the signifier. Lacan is no longer talking about signifiers here. The symptom and the matheme alike occur not at the level of the word, but at the level of the letter. Not the signifier, but its fragmented, partial form. This is absolutely crucial, because that's what the unconscious coughs up. Not a full word, but a broken word. That's what the symptom is. Not the full expression, but its stammered beginning and sundered end. Page 16, 7 or 19. I will venture, therefore, to say something that takes the plunge. My idea of the written, to situate it, to start from there, which may be debated afterwards. Well, let's say it, colon, is the return of the repressed. This is a very clear expression about what he means when he says that symptoms are a kind of writing. Symptomatic speech functions as writing. It traffics in letters. And what he's saying here is that these letters are returns of the repressed. Notice how he develops this. It's in this form that it might have led to confusion in some of my écrits. If I have sometimes appeared to lend credence to the belief that I identify signifiers with letters, this is precisely because the signifier touches me most as an analyst in the form of the letter. It's as a letter that I most frequently see the signifier coming back, the repressed signifier. That's what he's talking about here. The symptom always looks just like an S1. It's just a weird, wonky letter. It's not a full signifier. What washes up at high tide is not a complete boat, but one the mast of which has been broken off, the galley of which has been torn apart, the rudder of which has been rotted away. What washes up at high tide is not the pristine bottle, but instead the plastic bottle whose cap is cracked but still attached, the plastic bottle whose wrapper label is now missing, but you can still see the trace of glue where it was attached. It's the plastic bottle that, hell, maybe only half of it washes up because some poor sea creature ate the other half, thinking it was a fish. What washes up at the level of the symptom is not the whole bottle, but a broken bit, suggestive of a bottle. What washes up in analysis is not the word, but the letter. That's what touches Lacan. So, in the instance of the letter, it's all the more legitimate for me to have imaged this signifier with a letter, given that everyone else does as much. The first time that logic, strictly speaking, was opened up with Aristotle and the analytics, there too letters were used. Now you heard me say that Lacan begins Seminar 19 on a trot, straight back to Aristotle. This is one of a couple of reasons why he is so hot on Aristotle at this point in his thought, because he wants to see the logic that he's developing at the level of Lacanian algebra and Mathemes and the like as an extension of the type of work that Aristotle was doing in the analytics, the prior analytics in particular, where letters were used to prop up logic. And isn't that what you see in the field of symbolic logic? In modern symbolic logic is a series of symbols, letters, numbers, and mathematical figures, not words. This is not altogether in the same way as the letter comes back to the place of the signifier that makes a return. The letter comes there to mark out a place, the place of the signifier, which is a signifier that is lying around, that may at the very least be lying around all over the place. In the end, however, we can see that the letter is in some sense designed just for this, and all the more so given that this is how the letter first manifests itself. So notice what's happening here. First, he's saying that letters are what touches him in analysis when the unconscious, when the repressed returns. And then he's saying, but also as a radical psychoanalytic theorist, it's also at the level of the letter that I do my work. The symptoms that pop up in analytic experience pop up as backwards, forwards, upside down, broken bits of signifiers, letters. And letters are also what Lacan uses when developing Mathemes as a logician in the tradition of Aristotle. I don't know whether you are fully aware of this. Now, that's not me talking, by the way, despite how well that fits with what I just said. It's Lacan. I don't know how well you are fully aware of this, he says. But in the end, I do hope you will think about it, because even so, it does presuppose something that has not been said in what I have been putting forward. There has to be a kind of transmutation that occurs from signifier to letter, when the signifier isn't there, when it's gone off course, when it's scarpered. The signifier isn't there at the level of the symptom. The signifier isn't there at the level of the matheme. Letters are there. That's what you see on the beach. On land, you see signifiers. At sea, you don't. And in the littoral zone in between, you see their letters. One would have to ask oneself how this transmutation might come about. But this is not what I mean to go into today. I might turn to it some other day. Where then does Lacan wish to go? Next paragraph. Even so, on the subject of this letter, one cannot feign that one is not dealing in a field that is called, wait for it, mathematics, with a sight at which one cannot write just any old thing. I'm not about to go into this either. I will simply point out that it's in this respect that this domain sets itself apart, and that probably this is even what constitutes what I have not yet alluded to here, at this seminar, I mean, but which reported in a few remarks at St. Anne, this other seminar 19 that he's delivering across town. See our mini-series on the psychoanalyst knowledge for this, which doubtless some of you here attended, namely, what may be called a matheme. So he's noting to his audience here, yo, across town in this other seminar on the psychoanalyst knowledge, I'm now calling this shit matheme. I posited that this matheme is the pivotal point of all teaching. In other words, mathematical teaching is the only teaching. The rest is banter. This is a profound statement on what Lacan is doing as a teacher. It's a professional, intellectual, conceptual struggle that he's been working with. I think from seminar 16 forward, he's really acutely aware of the fact that he's a teacher in addition to an analyst. And what would it mean to teach the work of analysis in a format so wildly distinct from the clinic? He's been struggling with this. I wonder to what extent this is even what got him thinking through the discourses. The discourse of the analyst, notably, versus the discourse of the university. When he steps up to the mic at a podium in a house of learning, in a lecture hall, what kind of teacher is this guy? Here you get a sense of how he sees his job as a teacher. His job as a teacher is to teach mathemes, literally, etymologically, what can be taught. That's what we mean by matheme in the Greek. And that's partly why he's choosing it here. What he likes about it, though, is it connects to this field called mathematics. This, for him, is key. And with that, we have to note, he is not just talking about letters, my friends. Lacan also has numbers on the brain. The good passage for this, and there are several, is at the bottom of page 12. Not just letters, but also numbers. Check it out. Because after all, in the correct use that stands to be made of it, once logic has allowed itself to peel apart a little from the real, ooh, that's a tricky run right there, which in truth is the only way for it to be identified in relation to the real. That is to say, once it has been guaranteed only by the portion of the real in which a truth is possible, that is to say, mathematics, one can clearly see that any there exists statement whatsoever is but a number that fulfills the terms of an equation, for example. And then a few more lines down. I'm not settling the question as to whether number is to be considered real or not. So as not to leave you in any ambiguity, I can tell you that I do settle the question. Number is part of the real. It is, however, a privileged real, in regard to which the handling of truth allows logic to progress. So in this passage, which is the crunchiest one that we've stumbled into in this opening lecture in our series on Seminar 19, you see several terms together: logic, the real, truth. The list goes on, mathematics and number. The part that I want you to notice here is that logic is what we see occurring at and around the matheme. The matheme is a certain type of proposition, the logic of which is truth valuational. Mathemes can have truth values that are high or low. The test of any given matheme's truth value is the extent to which it approximates the real, the extent to which it figures the real. In other words, how much of the truth does a matheme speak, utter, pronounce, inscribe? There's the part of truth that can be written and the part that can't. A matheme is the part of truth that can be written. And the question is, how closely does that written truth approximate the part of truth that can't be written? That's what he's up to here. Logic peels apart a little bit from the real, insofar as it has a high truth value. And the form in which this logic shows up is not just a lettered form, but also a numbered form. It's not just alphabet soup when you look at Lacan's algebra. It's also a numbers game. And let's face it, Lacan's theory of sexual difference, as presented in his famous formulas of sexuation, which we'll come to, as we've come to in the past, with all of their upside-down A's and backward E's, these formulas of sexuation that you've seen so many times, including in our previous series, it's not just alphabet soup. It's also a numbers game, even more fundamentally a numbers game. As we learned in our series on Seminar 18, which is definitely worth summarizing here, the difference between men and women has to do with the percentages of each subjectivity for which the phallic function, by which I mean castrative logic, is valid. To be a man, you heard me say in our series on Seminar 18, is to have 100% of one's enjoyment determined by castration. That's what the upside down capital AX next to capital VX means. To be a man, anatomically or otherwise, a man is just a subject position for Lacan, it's a function, is to have 100% of your enjoyment determined by castration. To be a woman, however, you've heard me say, is to have 1 to 99% of one's enjoyment determined by castration. The formulas for feminine subjectivity that Lacan starts to develop in Seminar 18, and now has in mind and is popping through at the start of Seminar 19, these are formulas that point to a greater than or equal to 1% castrated and a less than or equal to 99% castrated. And there's the disjoint at the level of number, at the level of mathematics. To be a man is to be 100% castrated, and to be a woman is to be 1 to 99% castrated. None of which allows for an easy, friction-free relation. To say nothing of a sexual relation, a normative relation. But here's how I think we can end this, at least for now. These numbers games that Lacan is playing in an effort to approximate the real, in an effort to pronounce something that is impossible, even if only by writing it out in a series of formulas. This numbers game, it still leaves room for love, even if it doesn't leave room for relation, especially because it doesn't leave room for relation. It leaves room for love, of self and other alike. And precisely as we define it in Lectures on Lacan.